right. So one thing I wanted to mention, just off the top, because I was looking at it, I will be curving everybody's homework assignment or homework grade by a point, because several of you beat me in the tournament. Well, I did want to say, so I think Matthew Marshall had the most right and had the highest score no matter which way I scored it. Just the number of games, but also if you kind of use like the weighting where they weight kind of the Final Four, how many you get correct, and in the championship game, kind of you get more points for getting those later games correct. But also, I thought it was interesting. So Max Garrett, you were the only one that actually had Baylor winning, and he ended up with the second highest score. But yeah, you're the only person that had them winning. So, you know, it's too bad we didn't have any money or anything on this, but hopefully you guys entered those brackets in somewhere else. So we're gonna pick up where I left off. We kind of finished up discrimination. So the next topic we're going to go over is kind of amateurism and NCAA kind of sports. Specifically, I also want to mention before we get going, I have started kind of on those third homeworks, so I'm somewhere getting close to about halfway through those. I should have them graded when we meet, by the time we meet Thursday. I'll get an answer key up there so you can take a look at that once I get all those graded. And unless there's any questions for me before we get going here. All right. So we'll kind of start thinking about, we've mainly, and we've introduced some topics that relate to college sports, but mainly been focused on kind of professional levels. And it gets a little bit interesting, some of the topics we can talk about when, there aren't really salaries existing. Well, you could argue to some degree, but at least not to where athletes are being paid kind of the value of their marginal product of labor. So there's kind of a history if we go back. I don't know, this is, not waste too much time on this, but right, we had the Olympics being kind of the original amateurism, where the first Olympians, we think of them as, they're competing for their country. However, most of them, even when it started, were really being paid by cities, which now we can think about. There's certain countries that also pay their Olympian athletes. So a lot of them train full time, and to argue that they're amateurs, this is probably an argument you're going to lose. And then as American colleges kind of started to see the rise of club sports, and seeing that specifically, I believe if you go back, it was the Ivy Leagues and some of their crew teams were making a lot of money kind of participating in the events. And so, if you start limiting who can kind of compete at the college level by if you take any money or if you earn any money off of your performance in that athletic pursuit, right, they started to say you couldn't participate at the collegiate level. Right? So, this has kind of evolved into what we have today where, even when boosters or someone give money to under the table, right, it's illegal, and those individuals become, what word am I looking for? Like not eligible, right, to participate. So kind of goes all the way back to really crew is kind of the first one in which they started to have some actual limitations, and it's now developed to everything. Now, it gets a little tricky because we can think of our teams are still profit maximizers. However, the athletic department itself may not be generating profit because they may be taking, the university, the athletic department is within the university, so some of the money from the athletic department can be used other places. However, the athletic department for the university is still trying to maximize their profit. So on the balance sheet, it may not look like they are because they're giving some of their money to other areas of the university. Their goal still is to generate as high profits as they can, even if they aren't able to kind of keep all of them, and some of them go to other areas of the university. Okay? So, usually we think of universities as operating as non-for-profits, but the athletic department, is operating kind of as this profit maximizer. So just kind of taking a look at some of this, and we'll primarily be focusing initially on football, men's basketball, because those are the largest revenue generators. They're the largest profit generators in universities, at least for most universities that we actually see teams generating a profit. And we'll get into that in a little bit here. So we look at football. I had this data set, and so it was kind of easy for me to pick out some of the maximums, some of the minimums and things. Texas, by far and away, and this is a couple of years old, but by far and away, largest revenue out there. I mean, it's Alabama's kind of close, and I think there's what were some of the other big ones? I think there was one. I feel like it was a school you wouldn't expect, somewhere in California, probably just because of the kind of the size of the school. I think it was like a UCLA or maybe USC was up there, but by far and away, $100 million. But then if you look at it, the smallest school in D1, right? We've got Dayton at just right around 200,000, right? So we've got a pretty wide variance, right? Or a lot of variation in the revenue, and we haven't even looked at profits yet. Just the revenue that's being generated by these programs. So what were the top five? I guess I had them here. I guess it wasn't USC. What was I thinking of? The weird one was? Oh, I wouldn't have expected kind of this to see Georgia as high, but it's interesting. Now, if we look at profits, right, there's a couple that kind of enter in, because the idea is even if we can generate the most revenue, right, if I'm spending more on my program, right, that it doesn't matter. So we've kind of got our top five of each. You can kind of see here, some of them move out. Notre Dame, must be have pretty high expensive if they're fourth largest revenue generator, but they're not even in the top five for profit. We can look at basketball as well, so it's kind of interesting. The largest revenue generator there is Louisville, which is $42 million. Once again, Dayton kind of pulling up the rear. And you can kind of look at your top five revenue and kind of profits, right? Now, one interesting thing here in basketball, and I don't have the newest data, and so there may be some movement in basketball as well, is that I wouldn't have expected Louisville to be as high, and I'm going to probably get the company wrong, but I believe they had a big deal they signed with Adidas, and have kind of more of a sponsorship. There's a lot of things, I guess, on their campus that Adidas did with them. They hadn't done with other schools, and so I know that like the University of Michigan in football has done things with like the Jordan brand, and you've got all these teams starting to reach out to try to realizing, well, look, there's a lot of money out there, right? So basketball, not quite as high of revenue, but still pretty high. But also we can still see a lot of variation, right? Not all D1 programs are generating the same level of revenue. So certain schools are going to face certain issues that others won't. And so we can kind of start to think about, even within college sports, we're going to start to have almost a large small market issue. Now, large small market in college sports isn't going to be as heavily tied to things like population, right? But there are going to be certain programs, whether it's through prestige of the college or prestige of the program, are just going to have a larger consumer base, right? Before we were using population to try to measure that consumer base, it's going to be a lot harder to measure the consumer base here at the collegiate level, right? Because it's not tied to things like population near as much. Okay. Is there anything else I want to say here? I don't think so. But you kind of see some of your typical kind of teams if you follow college basketball at all. These are kind of the historically good programs, the ones that kind of can generate the most revenue. So even though basketball and football are easily the largest revenue generating sports at the collegiate level, expenses are also pretty high for those sports relative to others, right? So how many of these programs are actually profitable? I showed you the kind of the top five, what those schools were, but how many of them at that D1 level are profitable? If we look at football, the mean revenue is only about 5.3 million, right? So yeah, there are some large revenue generating programs, but there's also a lot of schools, like if we look at the MAC schools, they're not generating anywhere near kind of $100 million, right? Well, Dayton, is Dayton in the MAC? No, but comparable to a lot of the MAC schools are kind of in size and following. So if we look at that mean, kind of the profit amount, only about $5 million from these programs. The median is zero, right? So if we go back to some 221 stuff, if the mean is 5 million, but the median is lower as zero, what that means is we have some really extremely large, some programs that are generating large amounts of profit, and it's pulling that mean up. But if we just kind of look for that middle school, right, the school that has the exact middle, if we align them all from large to smallest, the one in the middle is actually earning zero, right, is exactly breaking even. And a lot of D1 programs, that's their goal. They're trying to break even, okay? So we've got about close to 50% of them kind of earning a profit, which means 50% of them are either kind of breaking even, they're at zero, or actually in the red, right? They're actually have higher expenses than the revenue they can generate. Basketball, similar kind of story. We have a lot more zeros there. So only about 40% have a positive profit amount. The mean profit amount is a little bit lower. So we've got about half the D1 programs are generating positive profit amounts. The other half must be kind of either at zero or negative here. Okay? So we can start to think about their sources of revenue, right? And it's similar to kind of our professional leagues. So at the collegiate level, unlike at the professional level, I mean, it is a large source of revenue, but they're making a lot more money off of broadcast rights and things like that. Ticket revenue is a pretty big revenue source for most programs. And this, is not just about basketball and football, but any sport, really, if we look at the collegiate level, they're generating money from their ticket revenue, right? That's their one of their main sources, right? So the problem is teams can't change location here. They can't change kind of their stadium size unless they build a completely new stadium, right? A lot of colleges aren't doing that, but they'll do renovations and things like that so that potentially we can increase capacity. Now, that ticket market's going to work the exact same as what we've already looked at. It's just that we have a lot more difficulty in actually changing kind of the size of that stadium. So I had some data. If we look at from 2010 to 2015, ticket sale revenues, and this is for the entire athletic department, right? Every single sport, they've kind of went up. They increased by 14%. So we see that, across the board, there's some at least increase. Inflation over this time wasn't 14%. So there's been some increase in demand overall, or that we see, if indicated by kind of this ticket revenue. So if we look at highest ticket sales, I don't remember what schools these were, but $63 million in revenue coming. I'm guessing it was probably Texas, coming just from ticket revenue, right? And then kind of our lowest, right, only about $500,000. Okay? So once again, really, we're setting this up. We have a lot of variation in the schools or the programs that we're looking at. Now, they also generate money kind of similar to the professional leagues through licensing. So if we look at licensing revenue, it's up about 67% across this 5-year time. So ticket revenue went up by 14, licensing went up by 67, which means these schools and the NCAA have realized there's a lot of money to be made by selling the likeness of players or selling kind of their team apparel or something with the official logo. So we've seen this go up like a lot. And this is going to be, we can take a look at the data here in a little bit because I brought it with me. But this has been, increasing quite a bit quicker, more than ticket revenue. There's a lot more variation here than in ticket sales. So even though the ticket sale variation is pretty high, there's a lot of teams here with every team has some ticket revenue. There's some teams here that don't have near as much licensing revenue. You can kind of think about probably comparing your University of Texas versus your Abilene Christian or some school like that. So I had some of the numbers in here. You can kind of see there's quite a bit of variation here. And these are just some numbers that are kind of interesting. If we look at broadcasting, this is where we start to get some more interesting issues. So conferences have their own regional sports networks. So like Big Ten Network, kind of all your Power 5 have their own network. Right? And so what would this be an example? So we talked about this with TBS, right? But if I have my own network and I'm putting on the games, essentially I'm vertically integrating, right? I can sell the rights to broadcast those games to myself at whatever it costs me. There's no markup, right? And so this has been an increasingly profitable area or revenue generating area for a lot of college teams, although really it's kind of your main Power 5 conferences. I'm not aware of like the WAC or something having their own sports network. So these deals really help improve, and we're going to be talking about competitive balance now, kind of going back to that idea, and we have it kind of going two ways, right? So we have competitive balance within a conference, And then we also have competitive balance across conferences, okay? So for these Power 5 conferences, when they start their own network, that revenue, they distribute evenly to the teams within the conference. So this is going to help improve competitive balance within each one of those conferences, because every school in the Big Ten is getting the exact same amount, right? It's not tied to how much revenue their games are generating, you know, the views that their games are getting. If you belong to the conference, right, there's this conference schedule that's put on this network. And if we distribute the money made from that evenly, then you kind of have this, you know, it's almost like small and large market teams are getting the same amount. Yeah. So Texas is weird because, yeah, they do. They have their own network, right? Now, the other one that would be kind of weird and was when Notre Dame has had their contract with, or do they still have their contract with NBC? I can't remember if they re-signed it, but they kind of went out and found their own network to put just their games on. Now, Notre Dame didn't vertically integrate. They went to one of these large broadcast companies. Texas kind of started their own and was able to vertically integrate, you know, by selling their games to themselves at cost, basically. Well, yeah, but that doesn't change the fact that they could have started their own network. Theoretically, right? They could have started their own network and then vertically integrated. But you're right. And technically now that they're independent, right, in football, but the other sports, they're SEIS. So they're a little bit weird. They're kind of an anomaly in a lot of this. But if they wanted to, they could have started their own network in a similar way. It's just they wouldn't have had 10 different teams' games. They would have only had just their games. Yeah. Okay, what was this? Oh, so within conference competitive balance is improved by this, right? Texas having their own network, what would that do to within conference competitive balance? Worsen it, right? Because now they're generating a bunch of revenue, and maybe some of the lower quality teams in that conference aren't getting, you know, don't have their own have their own network, and so that would kind of make competitive balance a little bit worse. And so I want to kind of try to relate this to what we were talking about before. So before, when we thought about these ideas where every team's getting the same amount of money, it was kind of small versus large market, right? It's harder to think about small versus large market here because it's not based off of population. But you can imagine if you have a school like the University of Michigan and maybe compare that to, I don't know, a Nebraska or University of Iowa, where if we just look at the amount of, you know, their attendance, their ticket revenue, it's not near as high. So the large kind of small market differentiation here is made by looking at kind of historical data and kind of try to use different metrics to measure what the size of those schools' consumer bases are. And we definitely see that there's variation even within a conference, right? Like I said, comparing that University of Michigan to maybe University of Nebraska, although, I don't know, maybe Nebraska's not the best. I'll pick on Minnesota, but, you know, comparing them to Minnesota or something like that, they don't have near the consumer base or the reach. Okay. So if the Power 5 are the only that have their own networks, excuse me, that's going to help improve the lowest quality teams, right, in each one of these conferences. And so maybe the competitive balance across those Power 5, the fact that each one of these conferences have their own network would help improve competitive balance across those Power 5 conferences. But if we think about competitive balance across every team, every Division I team in college football, what is this going to do to the fact that the Power 5 have their own, but none of the other conferences don't? It's going to make it worse, right? Because now every team in the Power 5 conferences, or the largest kind of revenue generating conferences, are all getting money, while all the other teams in all the other conferences aren't getting any at all. So we see that quality gap potentially grow. Right? Excuse me. So we've got kind of it worsens competitive balance across all conferences. Okay. So a lot of what we're going to be doing, there's not going to be as many graphs kind of related to this, but we really have to think about the economic principles behind. We've got these kind of very large revenue generating conferences that contain, you know, most of the largest revenue generating teams. And so that's going to kind of widen that gap. Okay. So some teams have their own networks, deals. So Notre Dame and NBC, Texas has their own. We've kind of already discussed this. If more teams started to do this, right? People will sometimes talk about college football as not having a lot of parity, right? There's a lot of imbalance. Well, if more teams did this, right, we'd see that get even worse, right? If Michigan decided, I'm tired of sharing, I know I'm one of the, maybe the Ohio State, we're carrying the Big Ten TV games. And so I know if I went out on my own, I didn't have to share this money with the rest of the conference. If we start our own network, we could keep all of it. I mean, we'd see competitive balance within the Power Five get worse as well. I don't know the exact details of the Texas one. I'm guessing, if I had to guess, I'm guessing that they're, what are they in the? They're in the SEC. They're in the Big 12. Oh yeah. So I'm guessing the Big 12 has told them, like, if you want to remain part of the conference, like, here are some stipulations, right? Because the Big 12 has to look out for themselves as well, right? And I would imagine if anyone, and it's probably what's preventing a lot of teams, I'm guessing the conferences have set some rules out. But if they did allow it, right, we would see competitive balance get pretty bad pretty quick. Now, one way in which, so all these broadcast deals, like this is, a lot of this is at least in some way helping improve competitive balance in those Power Five. One thing that doesn't help improve competitive balance, potentially, we don't know the details yet, but is if I get additional broadcast revenue from bowl games or NCAA tournament success, okay? So if I'm the NCAA and I'm giving out, money if you make to the team that makes a bowl game or teams that make the tournament and win in the tournament, if I'm concerned about competitive balance, what do I probably want to make sure I tie to this additional revenue? I probably want to say if I give, this revenue to these schools, I want to make sure that that's shared across every team in their conference, right? So I want to reward this program, but I also want to reward every other team that was within that conference as well, because otherwise the teams that have success are more likely to have success the following year, and then they're going to be more likely, right? And it's just going to kind of snowball to where I've got the top teams earning all this additional revenue, pushing themselves even further from those who weren't able to, have as much success early on, right? And that's what we end up seeing. Right? We see that a lot of this additional revenue has to be shared with the conference. So usually this is going to hurt competitive balance across conferences, though, right? If I'm thinking about if I've got the Power Five and they're the ones that get the most teams in these bowl games, well, then year after year, they're going to be getting the most revenue, kind of pushing themselves even further from schools maybe in the MAC or kind of smaller conferences. Okay? So a lot of this broadcast revenue stuff is really going to help improve competitive balance within conferences, but hurt across conference competitive balance. Oh, and I already said this, sorry. So that's my second bullet point that I just said. Right? Excuse me. So if we look at kind of just some of the different conferences, and I think this was 2017 or 18 data that I had, we can see that even across the largest, the Power Five conferences, that we have some variation in how much broadcast revenue they're generating. Excuse me. And so, if we look at the SEC here, I mean, what can we expect moving forward? I mean, schools in the SEC are likely going to be kind of moving away from the quality of the schools in the other conferences, right? They've just got a lot more money that they can put into their program. So this is somewhat relevant since it just kind of ended, but the NCAA tournament also gives out some additional revenue. And we kind of talk about just some of the numbers. It's a little bit astronomical, but in 2010, when they signed their deal, it was worth a 14-year deal worth $10.8 billion. The NCAA received in one kind of season, 2011, 2012, $680 million. 90% of the NCAA's total revenue in basketball that year. So these broadcast revenue for the tournament is just makes everything else look like peanuts, right? Anything that they do during the regular season is dwarfed by the amount of money that's made in this tournament, right? Selling the rights to kind of put on these games. So in 2016, so this contract hadn't been up yet, but they signed another contract, and I don't remember the exact details of this. I think it had something to do with, they allowed, it wasn't just CBS and TBS. Like, I don't know if you recognize or realize this year there was on like True TV maybe, and I think there was another one. So because of the deals that these broadcast companies have with other broadcast companies, they kind of redid the contract and extended it. And this time it was for only 8 years, and they got 8.8. So, if you look at the per year deal, it was quite a bit higher in 2016 than in 2010. So, is this deal going to help improve competitive balance? Right. So all this additional money, right? Well, 60% of that revenue went to colleges directly. So every program kind of went to directly. The amount that each college received was based off the number of scholarships they offered. So right away, right, your larger programs are going to be able to offer a higher number of scholarships. And so if the revenue that you get is based off of that, this is going to help to worsen competitive balance, but it's going to make competitive balance worse, right? At least between those teams that kind of vary in the number of scholarships they can offer. Okay? For schools that offer the same number of scholarships, maybe like the max number, well, this is okay because we're giving every school the same amount. So kind of worsens competitive balance across the league. So some of the more exact details of the tournament as well. Conferences receive $1.5 million if they simply get a school into the tournament. They then get an additional $250,000 for the next 6 years for every single win that the conference's teams get in the tournament, right? So it's quite a bit of money. If you can get a lot of teams into the conference, right, and they can have some success, you can generate a lot of additional revenue for your conference, right? So if we looked at some of the numbers, and this was annual, right? I didn't take 6 times 250 here. It was just kind of the initial, what they would get in that next year. I think this was, so last year we didn't have the tournament. So we've been the 2019 tournament. You can kind of see the different conferences get different amounts here. So as long as you get one team into the tournament, you get that 1.5 million. Sorry, it's not for like each team. It's for just getting at least one team, right? And then for every team that, every win that you get an additional 250,000. So we have, kind of some variation across the conferences here. Now, one thing we can start to think about is the marginal effect of an additional dollar here, right? So even though we're receiving the same amount of money, if I've already spent $100 million, the impact of an additional 1.5 million isn't near as much as if I'm only spending $10 million and you give me an additional $1.5 million to spend. So even though we have some of the larger conferences, like the SEC got the most in this year, and the Big 12 and the ACC, even though they got a higher amount, the marginal effect of that money is much, much smaller. Right? So, we might initially think this is going to help, or this is going to lead to worsened competitive balance because the largest conferences are going to have the most success. However, even though they're getting slightly more money here, right, the marginal impact of each additional dollar isn't near as great on the team's quality for those programs that are already generating a lot of revenue. Right? So it's a little bit harder to say. Right? It's a little bit harder to really get a clear-cut answer how it's going to impact competitive balance here because of that marginal effect of a dollar is going to vary quite a bit across these conferences. We could look at. I pulled some of this data from the recent tournament. You can kind of see there's a lot of different conferences. They have the automatic bids, so we're going to see a lot of conferences kind of be represented. But we can see that some conferences had more success in getting more teams in, which then increases the likelihood that they get a higher number of wins in the conference and generate additional revenue. So I didn't go through and I didn't have the time to go through and figure out exactly how many wins each conference had, or I couldn't find the data pretty easily. But you could have kind of reproduced these numbers, right, using the results from this year as well. Okay. Go on to the bowl game stuff. So it's similar from bowl games and how the NCAA kind of gives out money. So the BCS and playoff games attract a lot of viewers, right? So just for making it into one of those playoff games, whatever team makes it in, that conference gets $6 million, right? Well, the money's given to the team, but every conference kind of requires those teams to share the money. So conferences receive that money for each bowl game. They have a direct tie-in as well. Okay? So what is it? You get 2.08 million was the last reported amount of stipends for each bowl game, so you can cover expenses because, the NCAA realizes we want to put on these bowl games because we can sell the rights to these games, generate additional revenue, but getting your team there, kind of, extending the season, that's going to require some additional expenses, and so they give them some additional revenue as well. So in 2019, if we just look at some of the numbers, from all the teams that made it to bowl games from the Big Ten made $90 million. They then split it up evenly across the conference. So the way in which the revenue is given for football bowl games, that's going to help improve within conference competitive balance, right? So within conference competitive balance is going to be improved by this because every team is getting kind of the same piece of the pie here. Right? So we're going to see within conference competitive balance improve, but a similar issue arises to when we're talking about basketball is that all of these larger Power 5 conferences are going to be more likely to get the most teams in the BCS or into these bowl games. And so it's just going to kind of push them even further away from these conferences that don't have as many teams making it to these bowl games. So it's very similar to how the NCAA tournament revenue would operate. What was this here? I wanted to, I think I have something on the other side. That's why it's looking weird. So the BCS was created. So you basically, like all these bowl games, the BCS stands for kind of the overall arcing term of all these bowl games that are put on at college football every single year. And, the main reason why it was started was to get these major football conferences to kind of play against each other, right? Kind of some cross-conference competition. The goal is also to generate the highest amount of revenue possible, right? And so if that's the goal, what teams do you want in these bowl games? You probably would not be as happy if Ball State made it into a bowl game as if Ohio State made it into a bowl game or Notre Dame made it into a bowl game, right? You want these schools that have a really, really big following. You can get a lot of views, and generate the highest amount of revenue through ad sales and things like that. So the issue is going to be the very goal of the BCS is going to put your highest quality kind of teams that already have a large amount of revenue into kind of the best bowls, the bowls that will kind of pay out the most. And so the very goal of these bowl games is going to help, is going to lead to worsen competitive balance, right? Because you're going to get your top teams in these bowls, where the largest conferences are going to get the most bowl bids or the most teams into the bowl games. And then they're going to get a higher amount of revenue, which means less money for these non-major conferences, which just kind of pushes them even further away. Right? So if we look at, someone actually was able to kind of collect the data on the bowl payouts from 2011 to 2012. Similar stories have kind of existed since then, but you can kind of see, there is the Big East is kind of a weird exception, but here's your Power 5. Yeah, there's some variation, right? 33 to 55 million. The Big East is kind of a weird one, right? They're kind of in the middle there. They're not considered one of the largest 5 conferences, but they're doing pretty well. And then just look at the drop, right? All the way down to 5 million. So, these conferences, well, ignore Notre Dame here. They're actually doing pretty well, right? Because they get to keep all the money and share it with no one. But these other small conferences down here are really going to be hurt by the way that this money is distributed, or at least the way that teams are chosen to play in these bowl games. And I think this is one thing you could argue, well, how do I want to do this? So the way that the bowl games work in NCAA football is you're not guaranteed, like if I'm in the MAC or something, I'm not guaranteed to make a bowl if I don't have kind of a winning record, right? I have to, at least I think I have to break even, or I get a certain number of games where wins and I'm breaking even. In college basketball, right, they guarantee conferences slots. I guess the way the math works, you probably can't have a losing. Well, no, you can have a losing record if you win your conference tournament, right? So you can actually end up with, right, a team with a losing record from those smaller conferences in the NCAA tournament, whereas if you had a team with a losing record in football, there's no way that they make it into a bowl game. So, you know, football, we might expect if we started to calculate things like if we try to measure competitive balance by calculating the standard deviation and win percentages, we would find that in football, it's much higher than it is in basketball. Right? The variation that we see is much higher in football because the kind of top conferences are much further from these lower end conferences. Now, when I'm saying the standard deviation, you might come at me and say, well, there's different number of games. Yeah, technically there I should have said the ratio of the standard deviation to the ideal, but kind of the idea is similar. Okay. So, you know, we can see just by looking at some of these numbers, I wanted to just give some context to like how much money is actually being generated, right? And it's a lot, right? And we have variation across these conferences, and we're going to start to, unlike professional leagues, be able to start to break down competitive balance into within conference and across conference. Okay? So even though we have really, really large revenue coming from broadcast, from ticket sales, licensing, we also have kind of higher costs in college athletics, right? So, you know, if we believe that one way to improve kind of my quality is to spend more money on my program, it gets a little weird here, right? Because I think with professional sports, the way we talk about this, yes, we can go out and get better facilities and better coaches, but primarily where they spend their money is on player salaries, right? Trying to obtain the highest quality players by offering them the highest contract, right? Well, we can't do that in college athletics, right? Well, I can't do that directly with a salary, right? But what could I do instead of paying a student athlete with money, you know, here's a, $1 million a year stipend, right? I can't do that. But what I can do is what? How can I, and think about it as, I can give them a scholarship, but on top of that, what's the way I can increase not the amount of money I'm giving them, but maybe increase that student athlete's utility? So better chance to go pro is good. So what is one way I can increase the quality of my program without spending money on my athletes? Yeah, if we look at college coaches' salaries, they're just as comparable with professional coach. I mean, they're paid astronomical amounts of money that are comparable to a lot of the coaching. Honestly, some of them probably more than some of the coaches make in the professional level, right? So these colleges spend money where they can, right, on coaches. What else can maybe you do to attract an athlete? Yeah, we could probably Google it. I think it's Oregon's like locker room. I mean, they just look wild, right? They're spending so much money on their facilities, locker rooms, weight rooms, even their stadiums, right? To attract these players, right? Increasing their utility by all these other amenities. Okay, so what we see though is that we end up with this prison. It's not necessarily a prisoner's dilemma. Sorry, we end up with this equilibrium where I need to outspend it. That's great. If I get a better coach, I provide better facilities, I can attract a higher quality player only if the other schools don't do that as well, right? So there's an incentive for every single school to be the one that, puts a swimming pool in the middle of the locker room, something wild to like really attract the athletes. So we kind of have this arms race where every top level program is just trying to outspend every other top level program on facilities, coaches, anything that they can other than athlete salaries, right? Because they're not allowed to do that at this point. So if we look at kind of the budgets of these athletic departments, 14% of their expenses are kind of on scholarships, right? So this isn't just football and basketball, right? If we think about the entire athletic department, well, we've got, every single sport, right, that college has, and the scholarships that are given for each one of those sports, that's going to add up pretty quickly, right? Excuse me. So one thing about this expense, though, is if I'm giving them a scholarship, what's the actual cost to the university? I mean, it's a little bit tricky, right? Because if I allow a student athlete to come to my university for free, right, the only way in which that really costs me any money in terms of, you know, one additional student isn't going to, necessarily increase, we think about things like the buildings and that's all fixed costs, right? So it's not going to be kind of tied to the number of students there. However, if I've limited my enrollment, so it doesn't apply to, I think, when we think about these large universities, like even like Ball State and these kind of big D1 programs, but even if we look outside of D1 and some of these smaller schools that cap their enrollment, if I give a college scholarship, a free ride to a student athlete, but I said I'm only going to accept 1,000 students this year, right, a small liberal arts college or something, well, I've just displaced a non-student athlete who would have paid tuition. So it's really like an opportunity cost, right? Now that only occurs if I have a fixed enrollment, right? Because when I have a fixed enrollment, having that student athlete would displace a non-student athlete. Okay? So, I think I have it down here. Right, here we go. And we'll come back to this point in a second. So what's that actual cost? Well, if they wouldn't have attended unless I gave that to them, right, as well. So, if giving that student athlete the scholarship made them come to my school, well, then if I didn't give them that scholarship, I wouldn't have gotten tuition from them anyways. So there, it's like a zero cost, right? Because if I didn't give them this scholarship, right, I wouldn't have been getting any tuition from them anyways. Now, if they would have attended, even without the scholarship, well, now there is an opportunity cost there, right? I'm losing out on that tuition that I would have got from that student. Or this idea of if they would have displaced another student, if I had fixed enrollment, well, now my opportunity cost is the tuition that I would have been making from this other student. And here I'm just kind of mentioning, I think I've already said this, but the idea would be that, the wage I can pay, right? I can't give them $1 million, but I can give them this scholarship. And so my wage is kind of fixed, right? It's kind of set at whatever my tuition would be. So what do schools do? We've already mentioned this as well, not just on facilities, but they'll spend money on facilities, recruiting trips, all these other things to try to increase the utility of the student athlete in ways of, which is, not just from directly giving them money, right? So if we look at kind of the expense reports of a lot of these universities, it's going to be a lot higher than what operating expenses are because, if I put the value of the scholarship down as an expense, but it didn't displace another student and the student, wouldn't have attended my university unless I gave them the scholarship, well, really there was no cost, right? And so if I'm building that into my expenses, but that's not going to be reflected in my operating expenses, I'll see that my expenses or average expenses are a lot larger than that operating expense. Okay. And, all this to said, to be said, someone could have stopped me at any point and said, okay, well, yeah, you're not allowed to pay them money, but for sure there are plenty of examples where that has occurred, right? So you can resort to almost like a black market where you illegally kind of pay these players, right? Or maybe not them, but their families, or set their families up with a house or something like that. Right? So, and the reason here is, why would they resort to this? Well, there's always going to be an incentive to be that one school that does that, right? Because then you can attract the higher quality players, generate a higher quality team, generate more revenue. You could follow this all the way down the line. Right? So if we go back to when I was talking about what percent of schools are profitable, right? So we broke it down by basketball and football. If I look at all the kind of BCS schools, 72% of the programs, the entire department is profitable, okay? So this falls to 30%, or sorry, I said this backwards. 72% of schools show some profit, right? If I look at the athletic department, and I take away the revenue they generate, that would fall to 30%, right? So these athletic departments are really kind of keeping afloat a lot of these, are really generating a lot of the money at these universities, right? So other revenue that comes in to these athletic departments is through things like student fees and subsidies, right? So, these athletic programs like football, basketball, cross country, whatever, even though they're not turning a profit, on the books it might look like they are, right? Because what the university does is it charges students fees and then takes that money to help subsidize, right, those athletic programs. So if I look at, what's a good school to pick on here? If I were to look at Indiana State, I believe they have a football program. I know they do actually. I mean, it's not a profitable program, right? Their expenses are higher than they're not generating hardly any revenue. So the university will charge student fees or just outright take money from other areas of the university and subsidize that program, right? Now, why do they do that? It's kind of, we go into, I think I might save that for a different day, but the idea there is, somehow having this program is bringing students who otherwise wouldn't have been here, is the main kind of synopsis of that. So if we don't include scholarships, it actually looks like a lot more of these athletic departments are profitable. And that's because really that, like we said, a lot of those scholarships are really a zero cost. If the student wouldn't have went there otherwise and we're not displacing a student, then really we shouldn't have been putting those on the books anyways, right? So these student fees I've already kind of mentioned a little bit. So if we think about, and I kind of already alluded to this, but what schools do you think we would require larger student fees? Well, probably programs that aren't generating as much revenue, lower quality conferences, not the typical teams we think about when we think about big college sports, right? So it's going to be these schools that can't generate enough revenue to kind of support their athletic department. And really what this ultimately boils down to is whether or not you have a successful men's football, men's basketball program. Because the revenue generated from those relative to the other sports, it's just not comparable, right? So I already mentioned smaller conferences. Florida International has 70% of their total revenue coming from student fees. So, they would not be breaking even if they didn't have those fees. I looked at Ball State just out of curiosity, and this is not for one specific sport, but for the athletic department, 50% of their revenue comes from student fees, right? So really the athletic department here is really supported by you, right? You don't see it directly come out of your tuition, but it's part of it. Right? And then I think the school that had the highest just dollar amount was $28 million in student fees was Old Dominion. So what percent of these major conferences schools do you think probably comes from student fees? My kind of guess it's a lot lower than 70 and 50%, right? In fact, 26 of them, if we look at those Power Five, 26 of the schools in those conferences, absolutely $0 from student fees, right? So, it's kind of I'm going to go on a little bit of an aside here, but this is an interesting thought in that the schools we think of where they have large men's basketball programs and have a really large following, they probably have the students who would be the most willing to pay for those programs, right? They're going to be getting a higher utility amount from these high quality teams. And the irony is that they're actually paying $0 in student fees. My guess is if the University of Texas wanted to, I don't know if they don't have a fee, let's assume that they don't. But if they wanted to say to every student and give every student the decision, look, we can have no athletic department, or if you pay, $50 a semester, we'll have what we currently have. I would think most of the students, I go there, a lot of them would support that. I mean, not everyone, right? They would probably have the most students who would be willing to support that. However, they don't need to, right? And then when you have your smaller universities where the utility gain from kind of these sports programs isn't very high, I don't know. I would imagine a lot of Indiana State students don't ever go to a football game or even are aware they have a football team. They're actually the schools that are charging the highest student fees. So I don't know. I always found that kind of like a good little kind of irony in that. Other subsidies, it's not really that interesting to talk about. There's a trade-off, I guess, between these other subsidies and student fees, right? I can, take some money that I would have otherwise spent on, I don't know, the landscaping of my university, right? Maybe not plant as many flowers and give some of that money to the athletic department, or I could just decrease the amount that student tuition is going towards landscaping and just make that a fee and give it to the athletic department, right? So it's really just kind of a trade-off, kind of shifting money around there. Kind of a good example of this is, Old Dominion, I said, had the highest student fees. They don't have any subsidies coming from like any other area of the university. What am I saying here? No student. Oh, some of these schools kind of break this trade-off, though. It's these large programs. Some of them just say, look, if we can't have a self-sustained athletic department, we don't want one. And they actually commit to no student fees and no subsidies, right? And actually, we'll take a look here. I think I have one more. I'm not going to waste time on it. Well, let's look at the data, and I'll come back to this. So here I have this subsidy data, and I put this up on Canvas. I broke it down. You got 2010, 2015, but let's just look at 2015 here. I've got it all filtered already, so I added that filter to it. So let's look and see. Oh, I want to blow this up for you guys. So just as a reminder to set those filters to make the data a little bit easier, I go to the very first cell, Control-Shift or Command-Shift on a Mac, over arrow, down arrow. Notice it selected my entire data set. The filter option here is already turned on. I'll turn it off, turn it back on just to kind of show you. Now we get these little arrows for every variable. So here I could look at what athletic, well, I don't want the changes. I want just the raw numbers. So here we go. Who had the highest ticket sales for other athletic department? So this is the entire athletic department. So we'll go largest to smallest. I want to see the names. All right, so we got Texas, Ohio State, Michigan, right? You can kind of sort the data by that. We could also look at who has the kind of smallest subsidy, right? Who has 0 subsidies? So we would expect, okay, come on, this is going to be annoying. Let me see if I can get this all in the same. There we go. So the schools that have 0 subsidies here are these are pretty large programs, right? Probably athletic departments that don't need to kind of take money from other areas to support their athletic department. Although, being an alum, Purdue kind of surprises me here. Maybe they should start to have some subsidies for their program. But we've got some, other large programs, kind of low subsidy amount. Let's actually look at who has the highest. What we would expect to be is kind of these smaller conference schools. Sure enough, the Air Force, Old Dominion, UMass, Connecticut, Eastern Michigan, right? Houston's a little bit surprising that they're taking so much money from other areas of the university, but it's kind of interesting to play around with that. Like I said, this data is up on Canvas. You can kind of play around with it. We've got student fees right here, so we could see who has no student fees, so all these zeros. Notice there's a lot of schools that have kind of committed to that. But once again, Ohio State, IU, South Carolina, a lot of big programs here, although Akron's kind of surprising. And some of these smaller schools up here, but maybe they just committed, right? They think that, look, we can't charge any higher tuition, and so we're going to kind of limit the student fees. So this is kind of interesting to play around with. You can sort all these different variables. If you really wanted to, if you're interested in how to use this filter tool to answer some other interesting questions, and this could apply to kind of your data for your project. Well, notice what I could do is go to this conference variable. So it's not just a sorter, right? It's a filter, right? So I can deselect all these, and then I'm going to go to the MAC, the Mid-American Conference, hit OK. Now I'm only going to see schools that are in the MAC. And then from there, I could say, okay, who's generating the most total revenue in the MAC? So I'm going to go largest to smallest. Looks like Western Michigan, right? Well, at least we're not last, right? So, we can also look at, even though we're next to last, let's go largest to smallest here. Who's charging the highest student fees, right? We can kind of see here, we're in the middle of the pack, right? So you can play around with this and like look within conference, or even if I think in the original data over here, I had it 2010, 2015 were the 2 years I had. So what I originally did was just filter the data to only see 2015 and then copy and put that on a different worksheet just so it was a little bit easier to work with. But that filter tool is pretty useful when I'm trying to like break the data up by a specific variable and I'm trying to look for like minimum, maximums, just kind of more examples of in Excel. I want to kind of play around with the data here a little bit. Is there anything else I wanted to say with this? Any questions from me, kind of anything with this data, or how you would kind of work with your own data set with this filter option, or kind of the limitations or how much it can actually do? Okay. All right. All right. I'll go back here. So in a different file, I think I had some donations and contributions data as well. But, average contribution is $12 million a year to these athletic departments. There's a lot of variation. We got schools like Florida International making almost no money. And then we have schools like A&M. I mean, I don't know. This was a 2015. I don't know who it was. I forget now because my memory is not the best. But there was, some multimillionaire or billionaire who gave a bunch of money to A&M in 2015. So this is a little bit of an anomaly that they're that high. But you can kind of see, there's some pretty large amounts of money being given back to these athletic departments every year. Okay. So, I don't know. This is kind of fun stuff to talk about, kind of just thinking about the amount of money that is generating, some of the economic issues that revolve around these conferences receiving money and competitive balance. But we can also think about, they all have the NCAA looking out as a kind of a regulatory agency. So the NCAA does want what's best for kind of the NCAA product, right? So they have rules, and we'll start to go through a few of them. So college sports started out to really control these student athletes. And ideally, the NCAA, they can say whatever they want, but the incentives for them would be that they really want to prevent professional athletes from kind of moving on, right? Or going to a professional level. Because if they stay and play sports in college, right, that's generating revenue for them. Whereas if they go professional, they're losing out on all that revenue, right? So, they started kind of, they maybe started to prevent originally from these schools to pay individuals to come play for them, right? So, before they had done this, there were people who like literally would go play college sports, and that was kind of their career. They were like basically, like a minor league baseball player or something. They didn't deal with it themselves because, every individual college had an incentive to be the one that paid for the highest quality player. And so we end up eventually with the NCAA, and the way that they actually act is kind of like a monopoly, right? So it's truly a cartel because each school is an individual, kind of, you can think of as company, but they've all agreed that they're going to follow the rules of this one unifying agency, which is the NCAA. So cartel is the idea that, everybody within the cartel is behaving in a way that benefits the entirety of the group, right? And if we all act in that way, we can have monopoly power. Okay? So cartels usually, we think of, they're organizing some type of output decision. If you've had economic courses, usually a cartel you're thinking about, they set quantity, right? So that's usually how we think about it. So that allows them, once they set quantity, that results in a certain price people are willing to pay. And generally they set the quantity at whatever a monopoly would. And so they generate higher profits than if they were to kind of compete or be perfectly competitive with each other. And one thing that I don't think this usually gets brought up in a lot of like 201 or kind of your other undergraduate econ courses you might have had at this point, is a cartel, you can see that exist where they have monopoly power over whatever the product is, right? But a lot of times that's also going to give them monopsony power in the labor market, okay? So here, right, for NCAA, right, if every team is acting in accordance with the NCAA rules and regulations and kind of the following their output decisions, that also gives them power over the labor market and monopsony power over the labor market. So if we think about what is the output in NCAA football or these different programs, it's really going to be the number of games that are played, right? The NCAA is going to choose that. It's going to choose the number of games that that it wants to put on in these playoffs, right? Playoffs or the tournament. And so really what it's going to do is the NCAA looks at every single university, aggregates their marginal cost curve, right? Looks at the marginal revenue, kind of based off the overall demand for that college sport, and then tries to set, the number of games at whatever that optimal amount is. Okay, so I think I have just kind of a nice visual here. I'm going to go ahead and draw this. I'll probably pick up in this next class and go through some more examples of this. But I just want to introduce it today with kind of this traditional kind of textbook drawing. So you think about if we only had two teams, right, and they each had their own marginal cost curve, what the NCAA is going to do, or what the cartel here is going to do, is, well, look at every kind of quantity in this range. This second team, Team B, isn't willing to supply any games, right? Okay. So the only way that the kind of overall marginal cost curve is going to change is if we can get up to this quantity here, where Team B will start to kind of supply some games. Right? Then from that point on, my marginal cost curve is just the sum of both these schools' marginal cost curves. Okay? So, if I had this set up and I allowed teams to make decisions individually, right? Well, they're not going to face this demand curve. They're going to face a half of, at most half of demand, right? So this demand is going to be quite a bit lower. They're going to choose a lower kind of quantity. However, if they can act as one, right, and they face, the overall demand for that sport, right, we can kind of see that we'll get this quantity that's quite a bit higher than if we allowed either one of them to kind of choose it on their own. Like I said, I'll review this in more detail in kind of next class, but I want to introduce the idea here. One thing I also want to mention here is, we have two teams. The NCAA is looking at a lot more than two here. So this becomes, I'm saying this as though it's very easy to figure out what this kind of aggregate marginal cost curve is. It's not. Right? But this is like where we would start with two teams. And kind of also to mention, they are acting as a monopoly, so they are making the quantity decision based off of where that aggregate marginal cost curve is going to hit the marginal revenue curve. We got 10 minutes left. Let me see. We can review that next class because I think we're going to talk more about we're going to talk more about paying athletes, and I want to kind of have that in with a monopsony power. I think I might stop here. Well, let me look at one more thing in this subsidy data. See if there's anything else that's kind of fun that we can look at here. I think I'll leave it there. So when we meet on Thursday, I should have all those homeworks graded. We'll dive in a little bit more into kind of paying athletes. So I had a lot of setup today. I know probably not the most interesting. We didn't have a lot of graphs or something like that. But kind of just thinking about these issues. We're then going to take what we have talked about with the labor market and some of the things we talked about today and kind of combine them together and think about what happens to competitive balance, what happens within conferences if we start to play around with the idea of paying college athletes, right? And what could that look like? So we're going to be talking about a lot of theoretical stuff because that's not what happens currently, right? So we're going to kind of dive into and almost explore like what would happen if things transition from what they currently are to allowing colleges to pay student athletes. Okay. Okay. So I will probably put up an online quiz when I get back to my office today. And honestly, it's going to be very easy. It'll be like one question. So just get that done before we meet in class. It'll be due before we meet in class on Thursday. Kind of get those easy points. And other than that, if you have any questions for me, kind of as you're starting to kind of work on those projects, please feel free to reach out. Enjoy the beautiful weather today and tomorrow. I'll see you guys on Thursday.